What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and today on the podcast is a philosopher, a phenomenologist, a theologian from Duke University, brand new at Duke, but nonetheless he's there, Kevin Hart. We're going to be talking about a number of his recent books, looking at contemplation, the nature of prayer and practice, his Gifford lectures. And anyway, it's a wonderful conversation. I've been a long-time reader, first-time podcast interviewer, but Dr. Hart was great to talk to. We get to talk about Husserl. We get to talk about the contemplative tradition. And really, here's the thing I was struck by is as we look at the nature of the contemplative tradition, both in its religious and secular forms, the kind of way it orients our thinking and reflecting and experiencing in the world, it's rather striking just how fascinated we've become by our devices, by the kind of immediate, intrinsic, instinctual seizure of our attention, rather than the kind of contemplation that takes place both in prayer, but also in that kind of contemplative orientation to the world. What's being sabotaged or undermined by our fascination with the fascination. And towards the end of this conversation, we picked that up. It was a really powerful theme reading the book. It's got me thinking personally. And, you know, I know, just saying, I'm giving you the lure. You don't want to miss the payoff of some phenomenology, because it had me thinking for days. Anyway, thank you, Dr. Hart, for coming on the podcast, and I look forward to the next time we get to chat. But y'all don't know why yet. Here it goes. You can listen. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and for the first time on the podcast, Kevin Hart, who has just recently arrived to Duke University at the Divinity School, and despite becoming a Blue Devil, I still enjoyed getting to read his work. He's done a lot of work recently on contemplation and thinking about both its religious and secular forms, how the modern world changed it, the nature of aesthetics, and really what poetry in the modern context enables that so much of our other forms of knowing today don't. And it's been quite a bit of fun getting to read through a number of your recent works recently, Kevin. So thank you for being here.
Oh, sure. Thank you very much.
One of the things I think it might be fun to begin is for you to take us back in time when thinking about contemplation. You do quite a bit of kind of thinking of the way it's been reshaped in the modern context, but for people that maybe haven't spent much time kind of consciously aware of how modern epistemology and the modern subject might reorient what we mean by contemplation, take us back historically of how that kind of the pre-modern subject saw these kinds of practices and the way it engaged text, traditions, and silence and such.
Right. Well, we could go back quite a long way. If we think about our inherited word contemplation, that goes all the way back to ancient Rome. The College of Augurs, Cicero was a member of this college, would meet on the north end of the forum, and they would trace an imaginary rectangle in the sky and watch which birds flew into the rectangle from which directions to see if there were favorable omens for a battle that Rome was about to embark on, or for spring crops or fall crops. So if an eagle, for instance, Jupiter's bird, flew into the templum, as it was called, in the sky, that was a good omen. So we get the word contemplation and the word temple from the templum. And I suppose that means people looking up to the heavens, looking to get auguries of what is to come. The element of augury has dropped out, but contemplation has remained of the gaze, the internal gaze of the mind on God. So we do inherit also not just from Rome, but also from the Greeks. They don't have the word templum, of course, but they have the word theoria, which means to look upon things. They had the word theorus. Every polis had a theorus, and this was a paid person in the polis who would be going to religious festivals to look at them and see what was happening. This was a rather dangerous occupation because when you came back to your polis and you explained to the leaders of the polis what you had seen, they might not like it at all, and they might require you to be completely silent about it, in which case, if you spoke about it, you could be thrown from the top of a cliff. So being a theorist was a problem. Plato, when he, in various of his dialogues, talks about the philosopher as the ideal theorist. The philosopher doesn't have to travel to be able to see the God, because it's an internal process. So Christianity has really benefited from both the Greek and the Latin traditions.
One of the elements that I think is unique about our relatively recent context is the recognition that as a phenomena, contemplation and the practices and traditions that sustain it are rather ubiquitous across humanity and
Yep.
cultures and different cultural contexts. And we get to not only encounter that practice in the present, but we get to see how it was described or handed on in a multiplicity of confessional contexts. As a theologian, what are the kind of challenges that recognition of it being a cross-cultural phenomena, how do you frame those, and then what are the kind of opportunities for recognizing that, you know, part of the maybe the psychological mechanisms or the givens of what it means to be an embodied person kind of enable these traditions of wisdom or beholding to emerge?
Right. I mean, one thing that's been fairly constant all the way through is the idea of contemplation as mental prayer, raising the mind to God, not asking God for anything. It's not a matter of petition. It's a matter of being available to God. So that is fairly constant, but within that constancy, there's enormous variation, as you suggest. For example, in the 12th century, there's Richard of St. Victor, one of the great Victorines, living in a monastery just outside Paris, for whom anything at all could be contemplated. I can contemplate, according to Richard, a blade of grass. And if I do so, then I will be quietly pushed up by what I contemplate and start to contemplate things which are higher, so that I might, in the end, be contemplating the triune God. But it will be a long process of doing it. Aquinas, however, a century later, says you can't contemplate anything at all. The only thing you can really contemplate in reality is God, because God is simple and God is infinite. So it's only God you can contemplate, and it's not a matter of some kind of assent to God. You do ascend to God by practicing love of neighbor and love of God, having recourse to the sacraments and so forth. But the act of contemplation itself is an instantaneous thing. It's a simple intuition of God. And he says, very movingly, I think, that one might be in a contemplative religious order for a very long time, one's entire life, and have one split second of simple intuition of God, and that justifies the entire vocation. So those are two rather extreme poles in contemplation, and much happens in between the two of them.
Yeah, and I really appreciated the references to Richard of St. Victor, mostly for sheer personal reasons. When I was in divinity school and took a experiential seminar with Father Sam, it was the kind of experiencing the mystical life or something like that. But
Mm.
we had no assignment short of initialing that we did contemplative practice an hour 5 days a week, and then
Wow.
we showed up and would just and we would have an assigned text that you're to read through, right? Like that,
Yes.
start reading this text and stop when the Spirit compels you. And it was Richard of St. Victor that I was reading when I had later in divinity school, I mean, in my PhD program, I really found the Jean-Luc Marian's kind of like language of a saturated phenomenon, like that
Hmm.
experience I had with him. And reading this book made me realize how I've never finished reading the Richard of St. Victor book since then. It's just sit there because I don't know what how I would feel about returning to a text if all of a sudden there wasn't that kind of humming, resonant porousness with the divine that's lingered since then.
You've got a golden opportunity. Since you were in graduate school, Brepols in Belgium have produced a 10-volume edition of the Victorines with a
Ooh.
retranslation of the. You were probably reading the Mystical Arc that I was
Mm-hmm.
talking about. Yeah, there's a retranslation of it and a lot of other material by Richard and by Ashard and by Hugh and all of those Victorines. They were such an interesting group that they were canons regular and concerned to write theology, to reform the liturgy. They were involved in music. They tended the sick. They helped the poor. They were in the cloister and outside the cloister as well. I've long thought that they were a kind of model for a religious order. They were so inventive over such a long time, and it's great to have that selection of their works made available by Brepols.
Oh, the temptation's real now. Somebody's going to be making an order later today. Uh, can you kind of help us get a better idea of what contemplation is by the way in which you contrast it with meditation?
Okay, well, the standard distinction in Christianity is that meditation is to do with the pondering of images, of religious images. A lot of people do this only during Easter week when they go to church and they see the Stations of the Cross. Other people, depending on their tradition, might meditate upon a stained glass window or an icon or something like that. But meditation is always involved in the Christian tradition with some kind of image. So one's guided, the eyes are guided by what you see. Contemplation goes the exact other direction. It's the emptying of the mind of images and concepts. The idea being that when one can cultivate an emptiness, God will come to fill it. So these are two quite opposed strains that run through the tradition.
One of the things you did in your Gifford lectures, which people that listen to the podcast will know, I'm quite the Gifford lecture fan, all the way down to while in Edinburgh, going to read Gifford lectures in the rooms they were given. One of my goals is to have a job where I get to teach a Gifford seminar every year and
Oh,
pick
wonderful.
two or
Yeah,
three different Gifford lectures. So
yeah.
uh, I find it to be kind of like one of my favorite nerd things to keep up with. And one of the things I really appreciated about yours is the way in which you use like Husserl and phenomenology to kind of expand the concept of natural theology
Hmm.
to kind of respond to the challenge of the Giffords, right? And
Yes, yes.
so as a theologian and philosopher, can you kind of introduce, especially to people that this may be new to, how phenomenology of contemplation and such opens up a thicker or kind of expanded kind of naturalism for taking seriously as a philosopher?
Sure. Well, phenomenology is the study of how things are manifest, how they actually appear to us. And in phenomenology, there are famously, the claim is that there are no assumptions about it. So if you are a believer, you have to leave your assumptions about divine revelation at the door, that you look and see simply what manifests itself and in the terms exactly in which it does manifest itself. Phenomenology also is unlike most modern philosophy in that it doesn't articulate itself by way of arguments. It's really looking to respond to phenomena as they give themselves. And Husserl, most interestingly, I think, says that it is a contemplative exercise. So, this is one of the things which most interested me in writing the Gifford lectures, that We have contemplation as a religious exercise in Christianity. It brings us closer to God. It expands our prayer lives. But also here we have a major German philosophy, which is saying that philosophy itself is contemplative, that you can't do philosophy unless you're in a state of tranquility. This was overturned later by Husserl's most famous student, Martin Heidegger, who said in his own funny way that one becomes able to think philosophically only when one is not tranquil, when one is profoundly bored, for example, or when one has the angst of confronting one's own death. And in those instances and others, that the distinction between being and beings dissolves. And that's when one really does philosophy. So he changes from attunements to tranquility that Husserl goes for, to moods overcoming you. It's much more existential. And of course, Husserl is much closer to the Christian tradition, and there's much more there that we can learn from when we're reading him.
Yeah, yeah, and one of the differences there, even between Husserl and Heidegger, that fascinates me is the kind of the way Heidegger extends the phenomenological reduction. In your work, you spend some time introducing a number of concepts in Husserl that enable you to retrieve his more Catholic sensibility, I think,
Mm-hmm.
in thinking about contemplation. You talk about the concept of the natural attitude, the way he understands reduction, intentionality, and even like the nature of a phenomena. And those take a very different shape when the context isn't either like the angst of finitude or a ubiquitous kind of boredom.
Right.
Could you kind of introduce the Husserl's phenomenological framework,
Yes, yes.
and why that one was so attractive when thinking
Okay,
about?
yeah. We always have our attractions to great thinkers, even great thinkers who are not quite as we like to think ourselves. With Husserl, one of the things which is most intriguing about him is that he says, and I'm sure he's right about this, that most of each day we live in what he calls the natural attitude, the common sense world where we enter a room, flick on a switch, and a light comes on. That's the natural attitude. However, he does two things which go far beyond that. One is he says that the natural attitude isn't innocent, it has a thesis which runs through it. And the thesis is that every intentional object is merely an object of intention. That's to say, the whole world is completely flat and everything can be explained in the natural attitude. And he says this is not so, that what happens in our ordinary lives is that we switch from the natural attitude to various other attitudes. An example of this is what happens, for example, when we're high school kids. We go from class to class each day. So I might start off my day going into a math class, learning differential or integral calculus. As soon as I walk into the math classroom, as soon as I hear my teacher's voice, I move from the natural attitude into what Husserl calls the theoretical attitude. I'm doing mathematics, and it's to do with ideal situations. If the teacher draws a circle on the board, I immediately think of it as a perfect circle. But after the math class, I go, say, to a chemistry class. And there I'm out of the theoretical attitude and I've gone into the practical attitude. Or it might be the naturalistic attitude, if it's a physics class. In the naturalistic attitude, I see the world as a closed circuit of cause and effect. And while I'm in the chemistry class or the physics class, I'm in the naturalistic attitude or I'm in the practical attitude, and the theoretical attitude only is in the background. Sometimes it comes up, but very rarely. Then I might go to an art class, and then I switch almost invisibly, spontaneously almost, to the aesthetic attitude. I see things as beautiful, as sublime. I learn how to use color in a certain way which is pleasing. And so through the course of any day, We're passing from attitude to attitude. We're not just in the natural attitude. So that's the first thing that he does, which is really, I think, interesting. The second thing is that he says there's one attitude that we can adopt, which is much harder to attain, but which is very revealing. And this is what, as you pointed out, is called the reduction, when we are led back from the natural attitude to the phenomenological attitude. And in the phenomenological attitude, we can see how our process of thinking, what he calls noesis, becomes leagued with a noema, what actually is intended. And we can see endless possibilities before us. We can see this with regard to anticipation, with memory, with desire, with perception, and so on. And once we make that kind of move, the world changes. And as Husserl says, we see the wonder of the world. We see the world in a completely pristine sense and our deep cognitive involvement with it. And he says that when you make the reduction, it's akin to a religious experience. And I'm sure that's quite right. His student Eugen Fink said that when you make the reduction, you feel an awful shudder. And that seems to me pretty true. It's very interesting that the word reduction that he uses was not his coinage. The person who coined it was Hugh of St. Victor, one of those great Victorines. And the word goes through 12th, 13th, 14th century Christian discourse before it comes up in phenomenology centuries later.
This is a slight aside, but I'm sure you could, will have thought about this before. You know that passage in Bernard of Clairvaux where he talks about, let us consider the book of experience, right?
Yes.
So there's this
Homily
sense,
5, yeah.
Yes. When I was at the University of Edinburgh, one of the big research project across 10 universities, including Duke, that led me there was called God in the Book of Nature. And part of what the grant was addressing is this kind of bifurcation of nature that takes place when you have the scriptures, and then the book of nature, and then in modernity we develop a kind of rather reductive hermeneutic that flattens the biblical text over time in Protestantism, and then flattens the way we read nature to a kind of reductive, deterministic materialism.
Absolutely.
And Heidegger picks up on, mentions the phrase, let us turn to the book of experience in Bernard of Clairvaux, and does this kind of a move that's real similar to James' radical empiricism of like, we have this experience, so it has to be included in our reality, in our account of the world. And to me, that both what Bernard is trying to highlight, Heidegger picking it back up in his own context, is doing a similar move of what you're doing in the Gifford lectures, of expanding the reality we have to give an account for. And that phenomenology, or the book of experience in the contemplative tradition, is just, it's like there's a whole nother book on the shelf that modernity doesn't even know what to do with.
This is so right. Our everyday experience, you don't have to be a mystic or anything particular, that we have a much wider range of experience, including spiritual experience, than we give ourselves credit for. And phenomenology trains us in a certain way to, in what we would call in philosophy, spiritual exercises, to see how to account for our different kinds of experience, the different modes of experience that we have, and to become better informed of them. And I think this is something that the Christian tradition has always implicitly known. And Husserl is very good at drawing it out.
One of the things you do is draw this connection between poetry and contemplation. And you're also a poet as well.
Yes.
So I wonder, did you make the connection experientially first, or was it an intellectual connection?
Okay, well, part of it comes from teaching and the sorts of ways in which in the academy we've been taught to teach, as opposed to one's own experience. So, when I was a student, in the heyday of the new criticism, we went through a poem, we read a poem, and we were concerned, as it were, to go through in a linear fashion to see what its meaning was. Now, when I was reading poems myself outside of school, I don't think I ever did that. I would go back and forth. I'd be reading and then look back to see if there was a line that I'd understood differently now that I'd gone further. But I'd begin again and go on, go back. Namely, I'd move around in a circular way, or at times in a spiral way, that the poem would be there and it would make me think of other literary works or other artworks, other spiritual works, things going on in my life, and then I would go back to the poem. So the way in which I was taught was linear, but I thought my own experience was more circular or spiral. And of course, these days, and for a long time now, students are taught what's called the hermeneutics of suspicion, that we're not to trust the surface of the text, that there are things going on beneath the surface of the text which need to be uncovered, that are darkly political and problematic. Now, all of this, there's certainly some things are true. You don't like to be hoodwinked by anything you're reading. But there's also, I think, a different way of reading that we can teach to people with value, which is a hermeneutic of contemplation, which hasn't been noticed in the tradition, but is certainly there. And to my mind, it starts in the 18th century. It becomes secularized in the 18th century and goes on from there. And Husserl is one of the prime proponents of it.
One of the things I had never thought of until reading this is you describe how Kant disengaged contemplation in God in his third critique, right? Where,
Yes.
well, you have the first two critiques, but then this third critique, which has always been my favorite, but people that like Whitehead tend to like the third critique the best. But I remember reading the third critique and not noticing that shift just seemed natural, even if my own religious experience would have resisted it.
Mm-hmm.
And this to me was this like little connection point where the situating of contemplation in the realm of judgment and taste, which sets up, as you describe, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the categories of like aesthetic experience or religious experience,
Yes.
that kind of renegotiate the reference point of kind of contemplation and kind of naturalize the horizon that its experiential traction has. And I just, to me, the thing that really hit in reading it is, until you had pointed it out, I didn't realize just how powerful that had even impacted my own experience,
Hmm.
even though I could sit there and I give testimony to contemplative intensities, and so that the framing was so modern. And so I wonder if you could kind of share how, in talking and teaching and kind of introducing prayer, and also this kind of potential for poetry to function as the way in which kind of unexamined suspicion shows up in both future clergy and just in the general classroom. Like, what are the ways we've kind of diminished the thickness of experience with the nature of suspicion, and possibly closed ourselves off from recognizing the resonance that's already present in our own experience.
Right. I think we do this all the time. And I think that being in the natural attitude and not seeing other attitudes is a large part of it. We notice this, I think, when we're reading secular literature, when we read it pretty much in the academy, only through the lens of politics and history. And these things are certainly there, but it's become, for one thing, very tiresome, just an endless repetition of the same few moves. And also, it's such a restriction of what we regard as literature that you would hear, as I do all the time, complaints from undergraduate students and graduate students too, that they came to university to study literature to read great works and to appreciate the beauty of great works and to make themselves think better by reading Shakespeare or Milton or Wordsworth or whoever it might be. But what happens is when you go into class, there's a much more narrow focus upon our own preoccupations in 21st century American politics. So there's that kind of problem. And a hermeneutics of contemplation expands that very considerably. I think that's probably the main thing that I'd want to point out.
One of the other elements that shows up, right? What if the practice of attention is one that has been occupied by suspicion, then the world as it gives itself becomes primarily an object in which we master to then name the power dynamics deceptively or corrosively at work in it. And there's a kind of the world as it gives itselfness that contemplation and the wisdom traditions have at its center, that when properly attuned to reality, there is a thickness and a graciousness and a receptivity at the heart of existence.
Right.
And those
good
kind of
example
habits of
this,
suspicion undermine it. Yeah.
right. I mean, a good example of this in that particular book, My Gifford Lectures, Lands of Likeness, is the chapter on Gerard Manley Hopkins' beautiful sonnet, The Windhover. Now, if you think about it, if Hopkins remained in the natural attitude and he saw this kestrel in the sky, what could he have possibly written? He might have jotted down in his diary, I saw a kestrel this morning. That would be about it. But in the sonnet, as he writes it, he passes very quickly from the natural attitude of seeing this bird to a whole rush of different mental frameworks, which he unifies in the most exacting and powerful manner in the sestet of the sonnet, so that you start to see reality in your terms as very thick. He's seeing it aesthetically. He's seeing it, he's perceiving something. He's going beyond ordinary perception. He's seeing things in a religious way. He's relating this to his own taking of vows in the Society of Jesus in a few weeks' time. So there's an autobiographical framework going on. And all of this, as he says, buckles at once. Now, you can't do that if you remain stuck in the natural attitude. Similarly, we might say in 21st century America, if we're reading works about the scriptures, so much of the quests for the historical Jesus and modern biblical criticism is just based on the natural attitude, and there seems to be no way in which to get a historical critic out of that attitude. So that you have even bizarre situations, such as someone commenting on one of the miracles of Jesus or the resurrection of Jesus and saying, well, miracles don't happen. No one rises from the dead. No one is born of a virgin. Now, that's what you're going to see if you are stuck in the natural attitude. But clearly what Jesus is doing and what the scriptures are doing is trying to nudge us out of that habit of perception and see things in a different way.
In that section on Hopkins, I love the way you develop Inscape. If you want to say just a bit about that.
Well, Inscape and Instress are words that Hopkins coined. In fact, he coined them when he was an undergraduate, age 19, which is quite extraordinary. And he's really trying to find in Inscape and Instress a particular pattern, a gestalt, that will somehow bespeak the energies of the spirit. So he can see God in action in a particular configuration of leaves or flowers. And so that's the inscape. And the instress is the energy which is holding that shape together. There's a lot been said about him finding this idea in Scotus. Well, I think he probably looked over Scotus when he was in seminary, but he had found a version of it in Ruskin beforehand. He was a very avid amateur sketcher, and so he read Ruskin on drawing, and Ruskin was onto this very, very early. And then I think Hopkins found confirmation in Scotus.
You mentioned a bit earlier about this kind of hermeneutics of contemplation,
Hmm.
and I wonder if you could describe how poetry becomes a site for contemplation, because in the book you talk about the ways in which even though poetry has been detached increasingly in a modern or secular context from
Hmm.
explicitly religious frameworks, they do have this kind of they explore emotion contemplated. I think is one of the phrases
Hmm.
that I remember you is saying, and the contemplative mind then in relationship to art or mortality and these things show back up in this context. So when we talk about this hermeneutics of contemplation being potentially cultivated in a modern context with poetry, like what's the potential or invitation you see there?
It's an interesting thing. If one goes all the way back to the late fifth, early sixth century to the writer we call Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite, when he talks there about the movements of the soul, which are like the movements of the angels, he thinks. And he says there are roughly three movements. There's a linear movement, the discursive movement, but there's also a circular movement and a spiral movement. Now, in most of what we do in school, college, graduate school, we're concerned with the linear movement of a discursive understanding of something. However, in contemplation, as Pseudo-Denis points out, we pass from a linear approach to a circular one or a spiral one. So if I'm engaged in an act of contemplation of God, I might pass from thinking of God as just to God as merciful to God as all powerful, and so on. And I will do that in a kind of circle. Or there might be a spiral involved when I might think of the ways in which God's mercy is found in my own life as I reflect upon it. And so I go from thinking of the attributes of God into things in my past or in my present or what might come in my future. And in that way, I've passed from a linear model to a circular or a spiral model. And I think one of the things that we can do when we're reading poetry or looking at works of art, listening to music, indeed, is try to cultivate that sense of a circular movement or a spiral movement. And I think this is generally more attuned to what we do when we're out of school than what we do when we're in school.
I'd love for you to talk about how you see the relationship of contemplation and fascination,
Yes.
how
Okay.
that rise of fascination kind of opens up a new mode.
Right. I mean, one of the things I do in Lands of Likeness, the Gifford lectures, is I try as persistently as possible to distinguish these two phenomena. So it doesn't take much to notice that in our day and age, we live in a time of what I would call fascination. We are beset at every moment by screens, by laptops, computers, TVs, our iPhones. And what happens in fascination is that our gaze is trapped. It becomes preoccupied with a particular image and it cannot disengage itself. And we have the experience of a kind of sourness, a kind of emptiness, a kind of staleness. People become fascinated by, as we're driving along on the freeway, if there's an accident. People slow down and rubberneck at the accident. This is a kind of fascination. This goes all the way back to ancient Rome, where people would, where it was thought that the eye was active and there could be an evil eye, a malevolent gaze, so that the emperor in the Colosseum would always have a deformed person standing next to him. so that people became fascinated by the deformed person, and the gaze of envy, which would otherwise go to the emperor, was diverted to this fascinated gaze of the deformed person. Beautiful young women, handsome young boys in Rome would wear a particular amulet of a phallus, which would fascinate the people as they walked by, and so the gaze was averted from their face. Generals coming through with a triumph through Rome would have a large phallus underneath the chariot, so that the gazes of envy, jealousy would be deflected, and they would not become cursed by this. So we don't have that sense of active gazes these days, but we have something almost as insidious, the way in which our gaze is captured by screens. Contemplation is a phased counterpart to that. Rather, it's to do with the freedom of the gaze. When one is contemplating something, one is free to move around, as I say, in a circular fashion or in a spiral fashion. And when you cease the act of contemplation, there is a sense of peace and of enrichment, not of staleness. So I think that they're very different things. There is a poetry of contemplation, but there's also a poetry, and sometimes a very fine poetry, of fascination. And I give some examples of this in the book.
I found this part of the discussion to be scary. Like it, and as someone that, I just finished teaching a seminar on AI and religion, and do a lot of like science, religion, technology, such, right? And reading this, it raises to the fore just the impact of the unexamined adoption of smartphones, which have a quantitative surveillance mechanism for where we pause on the screen, what we like, what we orient. It gets to know our pre-conscious desires that are over-determined by our biological kind of drives, and then learns how to hold our attention.
Right.
It monetizes fascination, and holds us and orients us by the very desires that the wisdom traditions are inviting us to move beyond or transcend or consciously tame, and these kinds of things. That the idea that the traditions which celebrate and invite people to cultivate contemplation have, in many ways, silently assented to the introduction of the swinging phallus of a pagan deity in the form of a smartphone.
Yes.
Right? Seems to be a central element that is generating, part of the spiritual crisis of sorts in the modern context. Like you have one line where you talk about how this generates a relentless enchantment with one thing or another. And then I read that and then thought, yeah, and the sad thing is it has algorithmically known us more effectively than we know ourselves in the uncontemplative space,
Right.
and then gives us one thing or another. So anyway, you intensified my nightmares about this
well, you put
predicament.
it all very well. And of course, one of the aspects of this, which has been known in what you call the wisdom tradition for a very long time, is that once you go down this path, there is no end to it. There's no time when we're looking at our smartphones when there's a natural time to put them down. We always want more. We'll go back and just check that app one more time. We'll see what the weather is, or what the stock market is doing, or what President Trump has just said, or whatever. There's no termination for it. It's like the quest for pleasure. We can have one pleasure after another, and we never get to a conclusion of them because we become fascinated by our own pleasures.
There's one other feature of it that I'd love for you to kind of unpack, and maybe do so in how people have responded to the conversations you've had around it, because fascination, unlike contemplation, as you describe it, tends to be constraining rather than generative, right? And
Yes,
so,
yes.
which is funny, given we spent a lot of time talking about generative AI.
Hmm.
when fascinated individuals they feel unable to disengage from the object of their captivation, whether it's a screen or you mentioned celebrities or kind of or even like your own victimhood and brooding. There's just different ways it shows up, but that contrasts with the freedom or the kind of adventurous spirit that a thick account of contemplation kind of puts forth. And so that addictive nature of fascination, where you become so engrossed in a meaningless activities with kind of that endless checking in. You talk about how it leads to a prolonged emptiness.
Hmm.
And so I wonder if there's how you see both the kind of emergence of a prolonged emptiness and the way we would both maybe to ourselves and to the community or society at large kind of give the invitation of contemplation.
Right. I mean, it's so hard to know really what to say in a practical way because our society, as you've nicely explained it, is totally consumed with a culture of fascination. And indeed, we have given our phones and computers and everything else the license to keep going in that way. So they have the control, we don't. What I think in the Gifford lectures that I wanted to suggest is if we are attentive enough to the different attunements, the different mental attitudes that we can have as human beings over the course of a day, it might be possible for us to be led back to engage in a reduction from fascination to contemplation. Now, some things do this better than others. For example, if we go to church, and this varies a lot with one's own tradition, you go into church and we enter church generally with the natural attitude, but there are various liturgical gestures that go on. You might genuflect, you might hear a particular voice, you might hear music, a hymn, you might smell incense, there might be an icon or something like this. And these things have a way of leading us out of our culture of fascination into something far more contemplative. Now, the same thing happens when we go to a concert. Something similar happens when we go to a concert. For a start, we generally dress up. We go to the concert area, we drive there, we enter, there's a different smell, we hear the orchestra or or whatever the group is tuning up. There's certain rituals that help us to pass from the natural attitude and often states of fascination to something far more contemplative. So I think we have possibilities in our culture for doing this, but they're becoming few and far between, and we have to be alert to them and actually follow them, much more so than previous generations.
In the contemplation book, you reflect on how fascination is such an effective category for understanding what Nietzsche meant by the death of God.
Yes.
And I was trying to find. I had pulled out. Here's the line in the book, and I'll just read it because it was one of
Mm.
these where I was just like, oh, I feel like if I had, I feel like he was reading my intuitions, but finding words to help me gather it. You see, this is a large part of what Nietzsche meant by God is dead. Even if one goes to church, synagogue, mosque, or temple, even if one says prayers at home, the chances that one does so in the wake of the death of God. For all intents and purposes, he has died in our daily lives, which go on, taking almost all our attention, regardless of what we tell ourselves. We believe most deeply. He has died in our minds. Our understanding does not see him luminously at the end of our desire to know, and he has died in our hearts. We seek ultimate satisfaction elsewhere in family, work, travel, and pleasure. It is not exclusively a modern event, but it has come to characterize Western modernity. When people arrive at this realization, they will sometimes become drawn to contemplation, and once they begin to practice it, in one mode or another, they start to see concretely how it differs from fascination. And just on the side of it, I was just like, okay, preach, Kevin, preach was the commentary on the side. But as someone who's spent so much time both engaging the theological traditions in the past, but also the philosophical context, could you kind of help us understand how you're reading that death of God there in Fascination, and what the kind of revival of contemplation looks like that you're gesturing towards?
Right. Um, well, one way of thinking about it is imagine that you and a friend go for a walk somewhere in North Carolina on the weekend. You go on a hike. If you're a believer and your friend is not a believer, you're going to have very different experiences. It might well be that your friend looks at all the beauty of the North Carolina landscape and sees this in entirely secular terms as just beauty, or in reductive terms as just so much cellulose and all of that. But if you're a believer, you're not seeing nature, you're seeing creation. And that's a different thing, because if you're seeing creation, you're not simply seeing something just as beautiful, you're seeing that it is created, and created with particular ends in mind, one of which is the giving of beauty. So you're going to have very different views of this. If you're a believer, you're not going to see God as being dead. You're going to see God as active in the very trees that you're looking at, in the grass you're walking on. And your friend, if he or she is not a believer, simply won't see that. It'll just be an exercise to become healthy, to recover one's ability to work more, or something like that. So it's very interesting. In the passage you mention, I juxtapose Nietzsche in his sense of the death of God, that we're unmoored from. There's no ground anymore. There's no end to our existence. It's as though we are moving in darkness back and forth at a fast rate, and we don't know where we're going. That notion of movement is so different from the notion of movement you get in Pseudo-Denis the Areopagite, where he talks about the movements of the soul, which are interior, as I've said before, linear, circular, and spiral. But those movements are there in contemplation to enrich us, to give us a much fuller experience of ordinary life, without this sense of being thrown around chaotically where there is no ground and no sky.
I wonder if you could talk about the significance of attitude and the kingdom attitude as
Oh,
you
yeah.
develop it.
Yeah. Okay. One interesting thing in Husserl is that he came up with a number of attitudes, some of which we've talked about, like the theoretical attitude, the natural attitude, the naturalistic attitude, the aesthetic attitude, and so on. It seems to me that while these are very helpful, they don't explain the whole of our engagement with reality, and particularly in Christianity. I think that there are other attitudes, like the attitude of thanksgiving, the attitude of joy, the kingdom attitude, where we seek intimacy with God. And I think if we're reading the Bible, particularly the New Testament, we see this happening time and again. Namely, in my view, if we're reading the Gospels, we don't simply see Jesus as phenomenon. I mean, he was a phenomenon, and we can say rather a lot about him being a phenomenon as the Messiah, as his own interpretation of what it is to be Messiah, his attitudes to purity laws, and so on and so forth. But I think there's something more interesting that happens is when Jesus starts to preach, particularly in the parables, and he introduces us to a notion of the kingdom, and he engages in a kind of phenomenology himself, namely a reduction from world to kingdom, where world, as I'm using it, is the Pax Romana, the Imperium Mundi, the Sanhedrin, and Israel, what will become Israel becoming a client state of the Roman Empire, the sense of a whole being determined by politics and history. And he tries to shift us from that attitude to another one where we might just simply glimpse what it is to be intimate with Yahweh. And he is the means by which we do that. So In this reduction, we don't have the bringing of exterior reality into my consciousness where I start to analyze it, as Husserl thought. Rather, rather than it becoming interior, it becomes anterior. That's to say, Jesus in preaching makes me look backwards to the original goodness of creation and how it's been lost and how we might regain it.
So, how do you see the connection between the contemplative traditions, invitation to kind of divine beholding, and Jesus' teachings of like behold the lilies, or and a lot of the natural language where he kind of orients the same kind of contemplative mode?
Yeah, I mean, Jesus is in that passage in the Sermon on the Mount. He's trying to adopt, trying to get the people listening to him, the disciples or the crowd, to adopt a more interior notion of Torah. That, as he says, you've heard it said, "Do not kill," but I say to you, "Do not be angry." So he's trying to find the root causes that lead to killing. And he says, "You've heard it said, do not commit adultery. I tell you, whoever looks upon a woman with lust is committing adultery already in his heart." That there is some anterior stage. Now, when he says, "Look upon the birds of the air and the lilies of the field," he's saying you shouldn't be anxious about tomorrow. You shouldn't be in that state we've already described, whereby we're trying to shore up all that we can so that we can live comfortably tomorrow. Rather, we should take each day as it comes and shed that kind of anxiety, and we see anew the beauty of the world. And I think what he has in mind, it's a very interesting idea which is often passed over. He says, "Seek first the kingdom of God." Now, I don't think he's saying there, pray first thing in the morning, go to a very early church service or anything like that. He's saying that at every moment of the day, we should be seeking God first, of trying to find the kingdom first and foremost. And the kingdom, as I understand it, is a relationship, not a place. It's a relationship of intimacy with Yahweh, which for Christians is mediated by Jesus. We become adopted into the family of the royal family of Jesus.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. One of the things that I think I'm mostly interested in how this shows up in your in maybe in the classroom, because uh, oftentimes in the present there are detached accounts of the mystical life or the
Mm-hmm.
apophatic tradition without its confessional context. I mean, even say in social media, like the kind of appropriation of, say, Meister Eckhart saying "God rid me of God" and imagining he didn't serve the Eucharist.
Right.
So there's this kind of reappropriation of the apophatic or contemplative and mystical traditions apart from the kind of embodied confessional rhythm in which this very language emerges from. All the way down to, if you're thinking of philosophy of religion and phenomenology, where you get to kind of like third reduction and on, and this kind of those very texts becoming connected to kind of radical theology and such like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How do you kind of negotiate that whole tradition and the way it's been reappropriated in contexts that are still kind of overdetermined by the hermeneutics of suspicion that you discussed earlier?
Right. I think it helps if you can see them as parodic, hollow. They're not going as far as within the embodied confessional tradition. Everything that we can say in religion could be exported from religion and put into a secular context. It's very easily done. But it won't get you very far. I mean, you'll just have a certain aridity at the end of it. The apophatic, well, I think that what we find in the parables of Jesus is the basis of a cataphatic and an apophatic theology. So, for example, think of the parable of the prodigal son. There was a man, he had two sons. What we get there as we listen to the parable is a kind of cataphasis, namely that God is like a father. Well, we know what fathers are like. Fathers are just mortal people and sometimes mess up. But in that story, we see that God is also unlike any earthly father you're ever going to know. He doesn't demand the ritual purification of the younger boy when he comes home. He runs out and embraces him, which is just an extravagant gesture of love and of homecoming. So we have this relationship of the cataphasis, the like, and the apophasis, the unlike. And as always, the apophasis is much larger. But what the apophasis is doing there is not just some epistemic work, as it is in secular society. It's to do with the darkness of love itself, that we can't fully fathom what divine love is. The same sort of thing happens, for example, in the parables to do with kings. What's God like? Well, he's like a king. That's the cataphasis. But he's unlike any king that you'll ever meet, because remember, the servant goes up and he says, hey, I happen to owe you what in our terms is $3 trillion. And God says, oh, forget it. It's fine. It's cool. Now, no king, no president, no country is ever going to act in that way. So we have a ceaseless oscillation between the like and the unlike in that embodied confessional sense. But always that embodied confessional sense has the cataphasis and apophasis in terms of love. The limited love given through the like, a human understanding of it, and the extravagant sense of love in the apophasis. When we export that into secular terms, it merely goes into a kind of epistemology. We don't know a lot of stuff. What we know is a little island in a vast sea of what we don't know. And that's true enough, but it's not very satisfying.
Yeah, I often read kind of contemporary phenomenology of religion where like after Heidegger, you have like this trajectory where there's a kind of hypotheism of the radical variety and a hypertheism
Right.
of that problematizes phenomenologically that just the way so much analytic discussion of God gets framed.
Yeah. I mean, I think what we get as a heritage from Kant in different ways since then is we get two discourses coming. One is a discourse of transcendence, of that which is above our ken, that's ineffable, which religion actually deals with in its own ways, and what we would call transdescendence, that which is beneath our language, beneath phenomena. And this has attracted a certain kind of modern philosophy. One of my own teachers, Jacques Derrida, is a perfect instance of this, that he's always trying to find that which is beneath phenomena, namely la différence, which is the explanation of phenomena. Whereas the religious attitude is that in one way or another, it is the transcendent which serves as the explanation of phenomena, not that which is pre-phenomenological.
Yeah,
In
yeah.
many ways, the whole of modern phenomenology is involved in that problem. People
Mhm.
are trying to find that which is anterior to phenomena as the mode of explanation. You find this in Heidegger. You find it to some degree in Marion. You find it through that whole French appropriation of phenomenology. But I think it's a kind of parody of the transcendent.
Yeah, yeah, and those kind of conversations show up here quite a bit. How do you think this dynamic of say contemplation or fascination or these two different trajectories of phenomenology kind of reframes the challenge of divine hiddenness, because a lot of times, and this is one of those things you get assigned when teaching the philosophy of religion course in most places. It's required in the UK, and you get to divine hiddenness. Uh, it normally those contexts are framed by analytic philosophy of religion that already is kind of normalized modern epistemology, the role and function of reason, and the legitimation structures that kind of the whole epistemology is one of distance, kind of like based on this kind of infatuation with science. And yet one of the things of contemplation and one of the things of religious epistemology in general is that it involves engagement. It involves kind of an existential orientation, right? Like you don't get to know who Jesus is unless you're a disciple that follows him. You don't get
Hmm.
to discover the fivefold truth. Anyway, and so when you think of those who deeply desire encounter or experience with God and yet feel like the divine has withheld or is hidden, how does the resources of a phenomenological framing change that challenge and
Mm.
maybe the wisdom or invitation that perhaps the seeker gets?
Right, right. I think generally in phenomenology and also in 21st century America, that we have a preferred mode of neutrality, of perception, in sense perception, or even of thinking, of cognition. But when we actually read the Gospels, we find something very different. That the disciples ask Jesus, how is it that you tell us this stuff and you won't tell it to the world? And Jesus says, it's because what I'm telling you, what I'm trying to manifest to you, can only occur in love. And without the medium of love, it doesn't make any sense. So people must have to risk something of themselves in order to have the manifestation of Jesus as the Christ. In the medieval world, there was a lot of reflection on that beautiful verse in the Psalms, which says, "O taste and see the goodness of the Lord." And how they interpreted that is that at first we have a non-theoretical engagement with God. It's taste. All of our education is to do with theoretical senses, sight and hearing. But here we taste what God is. We try to experience what God is, for example, by praying, by going to church, by reading the scriptures, by being open to Jesus. And only after that do we see what's going on. We get some kind of theoretical confirmation, as it were, a theological understanding of what we've been doing. So I think no one is going to ever have any kind of encounter with the hidden God who doesn't risk himself or herself to some extent. There's not going to be a sign up by the moon one day saying, "Here I am, come and get me, God."
Yes. Um, for people who might hear the description of contemplation and not know where to begin, in your time as a teaching or in your own practice, how could one begin contemplative reading?
Mm.
Um, and I wonder if that's changed, like maybe how that invitation has changed when the context is both people who maybe have no previous relationship with a religious tradition, and so it are both foreign to its grammar,
Hmm.
language, narratives, and such, or those who, I'm sure this is, I know plenty of people have gone to Duke that are in this one that are like, well, I like Jesus, but the Bible's been used in such poor ways, and then the way things get framed, I just don't even know what to do with it.
Right.
So I wonder how that the invitation to contemplative reading sounds in our context. That's fascinated with fascination of sorts.
Sure. I mean, I think the thing is you just got to bite the bullet and start reading. I mean, the tradition is very wise. The best way to learn to contemplate whether in a religious sense or even in a secular sense, is to engage in one or another version of Lectio Divina. So, in Lectio, which has been formalized since the 6th century and was practiced before then, we choose a very small part of a text, let's say 3 verses from 1 John or something like that, or a short poem, if you want to do the secular version of it. You read it very quietly, paying attention to the semantics and the syntax, so that you actually have a basic understanding of what's being said. This is the Lectio part. Then you engage in meditatio on it, on meditation on it, and you allow yourself to think back as to how it's associated with other parts of the scripture or parts of your life or parts of the tradition. And then you pray about it. You bring your own concerns to bear, oriented by just those verses. And finally, after all of that, then you contemplate. You just rest in God who has given you this scripture for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. Very hard to do it for more than 5 or 6 minutes. The secular version of this is that you read the short poem, say, you understand the words and what's going on in it, and you meditate upon it. What actually is being put before me here? Does this remind me of anything else? Does something else I can bring to mind enrich my experience of it? Can it enrich my experience of other things? And then you ponder various questions about it that come to mind. It's like a kind of dialogue. And then finally, you reflect upon it, and you let the poem enter your consciousness. You might even find after this exercise that you've learnt it by heart, that it's penetrated you. The border between you and it has been rendered equivocal and broken. So there is a secular version of doing this, which is very, very helpful. But I think, obviously, the richer way is by Lectio Divina of Scripture, because one is then in dialogue with God himself.
How do you read kind of the contemplatives within the tradition? Is there a way to read them? Perhaps you have to learn to read them in ways different than we read, say, other thinkers that in more a modern context, or kind of like, or even the early Protestant thinkers. It might not be definitively modern, but they're kind of primarily oriented towards the articulation of right belief rather than kind of a seized beholding of sorts.
Right. It does take a bit of effort, it must be said, like with Richard of St. Victor, whom we were talking about earlier. Richard's book, The Mystical Ark, is an elaborate moral commentary on the building of the Ark of the Covenant, with all of the symbolism that's involved in that. And most people today, undergraduates or graduate students, it doesn't make much difference. This is a very alien way of reading. And as I say, you have to take this on faith, and you have to jump into it and hope that it will make sense if you're concerted in what you're doing over a few hours. And generally, the penny drops and people become fluent in it. The medieval mind was very different from our own, even if we call it one mind. It's sometimes quite difficult to understand what is going on. They had a very different relationship with Scripture. They had a different relationship with God. I mean, someone like Aquinas, for example, probably never met an atheist. So that people may not have been particularly good in the 13th century. There was the same rabble that we are today. However, they would have been acting in particular ways while still thinking of God as principium, as the basic ground of reality, just as they weren't paying attention to it. We've got a very different situation now, where people will not necessarily think of God as the ground.
Yeah, yeah. So I've really, really enjoyed getting to talk to you. It's always nice after you're like having imaginary conversations in your head while reading people's books to get to discuss it. Is there something I completely missed out with my own interest that you want to make sure to mention?
You know, you've got a very capacious way of doing this. So I think you've covered pretty much everything.
Well, I'll take that as a compliment. That's
You
fun.
take that as a compliment.
Well, and now that I know we're neighbors, hopefully we'll there'll be something going on at Duke where I get to show up and
Oh,
I get
sure.
to see you in
Well,
person.
it's in about 3 weeks' time. Jean-Luc Marion is coming to give a lecture in the Divinity School. You should come to that.
Really?
Yeah, sure. I think it's, hold on, I've got it written right down here. Friday, the 28th of March. Jean-Luc Marion is
Oh,
lecturing
wow.
in the Divinity School. So
That
all
is
of your
awesome.
listeners can come.
Yeah, I took a Marion seminar in my PhD program with Anselm Min, and it was one of
Oh,
the
Anselm, I well remember him. Yes.
yeah,
This,
it was one of my favorite classes, and after he read the paper and then and he asked me to come see him because I was like the token Protestant oftentimes in his
mm-hmm,
very much more Catholic seminars, like
mm-hmm.
the history of the Trinity and these kind of
Right,
things. And
right.
I write this paper on Marion, go into his office, and he he would look at me and go, oh, he's like, you just sound so Christian for a liberal Protestant. And he would start witnessing. He'd either try to lure you to be like a real Marxist or a real Thomist. Those were his regular regular asides in any class. But the Marion one was fun because like I'd taken a phenomenology class like doing previously in graduate school. But had never spent a semester reading multiple works by someone. And it also makes going to art museums when you live in Europe a lot more fun. Because
It's true. It's true. He's very good on art.
do you know what he's going to talk about?
Yeah, he's talking on Revelation.
Oh, awesome.
He's got a new book in English called, in English, Revelation Comes from Elsewhere. And his title of his lecture at Duke is Questions About Revelation, something like that.
Awesome. Excellent. Well, that's time I can read it before then.
Yeah, it's quite a big book, but you come along. I'll be there. In fact, I think
Awesome.
I'm introducing him, as I remember.
Well, it's not hard to say nice things about him.
No, it's easy. It's easy. I've known him for a long time.
Awesome.